If God is all-knowing, then it stands to reason that he knows about all the pain and suffering in this world. Not only that, but if he's truly all-knowing, then he even knows about it before it happens. If God is all-powerful, then he definitely has the ability to stop the pain and suffering. If God is all good, then wouldn't he want to stop it? But since pain, suffering, and all kinds of evil persist in this world, then it's our understanding that either God doesn't know about it, God isn't powerful enough to stop it, or God isn't good enough to even care about stopping it. So, if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, why does he allow bad things to happen to good people?
Well, welcome everyone. My name is Ken, and I am the Prescott Valley campus pastor. And I want to personally thank you on behalf of everyone in our Prescott Valley campus. I want to thank those of you who have literally put your money where your mouth is as it relates to your faith, where you've said, Jesus is Lord, and I'm going to take a next step and participate in this Excel initiative. And because what you have done is, one, this balcony's almost done. That means 100 more people at each service each Sunday, so 300 more people a week can get connected to a group of people trying to follow Jesus and hear the life-changing message of the gospel. What else that has also done is it's extended our ministry reach out in Japan, where we're able to help them reach people they wouldn't otherwise reach with their own facility. And then just a few weeks ago, we signed a lease in Prescott Valley for an office space, which will allow us to have a presence in the community during the week, and this fall start a student ministry midweek service that we can't do because we don't have the spot. Now we do. Thank you. Not to mention that in due time, we'll have a permanent campus out there because of your generosity. It'll get there. It'll get there. So thank you so much for participating. Now to our message. We're in the second installment of Though He Slay Me. This is our study in the book of Job. And to remind you, as Jason mentioned last week, the setting for the book of Job, it has two settings. Okay, the Job and his wife and Job and his friends. If you picture a play, a stage, think of a stage much like this one. And that's the first setting. Job and his friends, Job and his family is happening on the lower stage. And then there's a second stage up above that Job and his friends and his family cannot see. And that's the realm of God, the divine realm. And there's play and action happening there. And then we, the readers, are like the audience. We get to see both, but Job only gets to see one. And that's the setting. And the book seeks to answer a question that everyone asks: why do bad things happen to good people? And in this account, lots of bad things happen to a very good person, Job. The writer tells us that Job was the greatest man among the people of the East, and that he was uber wealthy. God describes him as blameless and upright. He feared God, he shunned evil. Job was the goodest of the good. In a matter of minutes, several devastating things happened to Job. His field servants are killed, the ones that were taking care of the oxen and the donkeys that were stolen. Then the camels were stolen, and the ranch hands taking care of them, they were murdered. All 10 of his children were feasting and having a party in one of the brothers' houses, and the wind came up, knocked the walls down, roof collapsed, and in a moment, all 10 of his children died. And to put it mildly, Job is having the worst day ever, and none of us would wish any of this on our worst enemy over any amount of time, much less this happening to a righteous man in a matter of moments. And then amazingly, after getting all of that news, Job responded with praises to God. And so today, we're gonna pick up this story sometime after Job's remarkable response to his very personal tragedy. And as we read this text today, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna just look and see what we can glean from the text, from what the author has for us. We're going to highlight the difference between suffering well and suffering poorly. And then at the end, we're going to take some action. And I'm warning you, this is a bit like a roller coaster because this is a book of suffering, right? So it's going to be really heavy, and then it gets lighter, and then it's going to get really heavy. So hang on, stay with me. Please don't walk out in the middle of the lesson because we get to the good part, and it is heavy. So here we go. On another day, so however many days have passed since Job's terrible day, now we're at another day. On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Give an account for your activities. Satan answered the Lord, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. So if you've read this book before, or if you were here last week, this exchange should sound really familiar because it is the exact same verbiage that God and Satan had in chapter 1, where Satan's like, hey, I'm gonna take out all his kids, his possessions and everything. It's that same exchange, but it's at the end of verse 3 that this exchange takes a turn. Here's God speaks up and he says, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. And at first blush, you read this and it sounds like God himself is saying, the devil made me do it. When he says, though you, right? Wait, isn't God the one who said, haven't you considered Job? Like God brought him into the equation. He's not blaming Satan. God is defending Job. And here's what I mean by that. Let's look a little bit closer. It begins with this line, have you considered? Like, have you seen Job? Like this guy, he's fantastic. You can't touch him. Like no matter what you do to him, this guy, he's my ace in the hole. He is always gonna be faithful to him. And mind you, while God is saying this, he said it in chapter 1 while Job is living in glory, and he's saying the same thing while Job is sitting in immense distress. So I would venture to say that at this moment on the lower stage, Job has no idea how God feels about him, what God thinks about him. And if I'm Job, I would suspect that Job didn't think very highly of me, given the fact that he is suffering greatly. He could not imagine that God would have any positive view of him. And in defending Job, God hits the highlights, right? He's blameless, he's upright, he fears God, he shuns evil. And in this exchange in chapter 1, when God highlights the same things, Satan basically, he does what he does. Satan the accuser does what he does with all of us. Revelation 12, you can read about it, where he's constantly accusing us before God. What does he do? He accuses Job before God. He says, look, Job isn't really blameless. Like his behavior is right, but he's not really upright. He doesn't really fear you because of you. He doesn't really love you because of you. It's all because you've blessed him. In a sentence, it's like, Yahweh, you bought Job. He's not yours. I'll get him. You've bought Job's allegiance. And God continues his defense. He says, he maintains his integrity. How has Job maintained his integrity? Like as I mentioned, he responded to after losing what seemed to be everything, and he responded with worship. Job showed that his worship of God is not contingent upon the blessings of God. Job proved Satan a liar and God right. Job puts God first because God is the first priority in his life. Everything was taken from Job as far as he could tell, and he still had his integrity. Wouldn't it be great if that could be said about us? Because what else do we have if we don't have integrity? And Yahweh continues, he's like, look, you incited me against him without any reason, which is true to a point. It's true to a point that like, hey, Satan, you couldn't accuse him of anything. You couldn't bring me this thing he did or this thing he said that warranted doing anything to him. As a matter of fact, you had to accuse him of a thought crime. You had to accuse him of poor motive. But there is a reason Job is suffering. It's the fact that Job is a good man, that Job is blameless and upright and fears God and shuns evil. That is precisely the reason Job is suffering. The without any reason is Job didn't do anything wrong. But with reason is that he is a righteous man. And then this exchange continues. God is boasting and defending Job, boasting about and defending Job. And Satan goes on, skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. And what happens next? So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. This is injury to insult. I picture like chicken pox on steroids, big, festering, scratching, itching. You can't just stop it. And Job was already riddled with mental and emotional suffering. I cannot begin to comprehend the amount of grief he was saddled with. And then you add this to his list of losses. And I'm certain that Job expected to die from this illness. And what leaps out at me is that the responsibility for Job's suffering is completely laid at the feet of God. There is no getting around it. At the end of the day, this book, the book of Job, communicates that whether good things or bad things happen in this world, God is sovereign and nothing happens without his knowledge, and sometimes it needs his approval. And if the book of Job was the sum total, if it was the only perspective we were given about how God approaches us in our suffering, we would have a very limited perspective about the character of God. This book does not portray him with any compassion or any gentleness. He seems to be a bit capricious and petty. I think we would see him as the bully kid with the magnifying glass, and we're the ant. Now, fortunately, this is not the sum total of how God approaches us in our suffering. And as we get further into this message, I'm gonna show you another perspective, but we're not there yet. Now, as Job is sitting in his emotional suffering and now his physical suffering, his wife steps in and offers some very timely advice. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." So wives, if you ever wonder how you stack up as a wife, just know this, you've got Mrs. Job beat. Okay, you're doing better than she is. Now let's face it, Mrs. Job is the elephant in the chapter. Okay, this is what you've all been waiting for. And husbands, I have a word of caution to you. How you respond to this section of scripture just might determine, one, if you stay married, right? Two, before this sermon's over, your wife might be looking for another church and you won't be here next week. I'm just saying. So buckle your seatbelts, folks, because we are going to examine Mrs. Job. Are you ready? So first thing I want to point out is the wording of the conversation between God and Satan and Job and his wife. How's that go? This is God again, and he still maintains his integrity. And here's Satan. He will curse you to your face. God, Satan. Now here's Mrs. Job. You're still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Wow. It's almost as if she is the mouthpiece for the accuser. Like, who has she been listening to? Who has she been spending her time with? Is she there with Job when he's offering the sacrifices on behalf of their children just in case they maybe sinned in their heart? It doesn't look like that. Her one sentence in this book is far from flattering. It makes me wonder, what kind of woman is she? What kind of wife is she? And what's really interesting about her is where she isn't mentioned. We're gonna go back to chapter 1, and we're told that Job had 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, large number of servants, the greatest man among the East. This is a list of blessings that God has bestowed on Job, and she is conspicuously absent. Maybe she wasn't a blessing. Maybe she wasn't a great wife. And this is a view that is espoused by a modern day theologian, guy's last name is Hawkins. And I could explain it to you, but he does a much better job. It's like a 25-second video clip. Let's watch this to see his perspective on Job's wife.
But I just got blessed with a good wife. Not every guy has a good wife. Sorry. I mean, think about Job in the Old Testament. Think about Job's wife. She must have been a real piece of work. I mean, the devil took everything from Job, man. Killed his kids, killed his servants, killed his livestock, covered Job in boils and sores. But his wife did not die. That's saying something right there, isn't it? Like, hey, devil, Job's wife's right over there. I know. Trust me, leave her. I know what I.
So husbands, if your wife ain't laughing, you ain't laughing, okay? Just let's keep that straight. You better spend the drive home just effusive in your praise of your bride. Now, maybe there is some validity to this line of thinking. Just maybe Job's wife isn't the brightest bulb on the tree. Maybe. Or maybe there's more to the story here. Let me remind you that the greatest man in the East lost his oxen, his donkeys, his field hands, his sheep, his shepherds, his camels, and his ranch hands. All the measures of wealth, livestock and servants, gone. In addition to 10 children taken from Job and taken from his wife. All that was hers too. And lest we forget, 7 sons and 3 daughters were fathered by Job. 7 sons and 3 daughters were not delivered by Job. 7 sons and 3 daughters were carried in the arms of Job, but they were not nursed by Job. She too lost 10 children. She too lost all their possessions. With the exception of the loss of her health, she too has suffered all that Job has had to suffer. So can we give her a break? Because typically, when it comes to the account of Job, she's either forgotten or vilified. Can't we all just give her some empathy? I mean, she says it, curse God and die. She said the quiet part out loud. And I, for one, appreciate her honesty, her vulnerability, her despair and her grief and her anger towards God were not hidden beneath a veil of piety. And there are some of you, whether you're married or single or male or female, there's some of you who have been Job's wife. Some of you have buried a child, a parent, a spouse, a sibling, any mixture of or all of the above. Some of you, like Job's wife, has suffered as you have watched a loved one suffer. And you are powerless to do anything about it. And you are angry. And to your credit, you keep trying. You open your Bible, and sometimes you read it. You show up to serve. You go to life group or a discipleship group. You come to church. You pray, and you sing, and you choke on the lyrics when we sing of the goodness of God. And for that, for your efforts to be faithful, I commend you. And unfortunately, none of us can see what is playing out in the upper stage, in the divine realm. And all we're left in with that for that moment or that month or those years or those decades, all we're left with is our heartache and our tears. So at the beginning of the message, I told you that Job isn't the sum total of how God approaches us in our suffering, that we'd get to another perspective. Well, now we're gonna get to that perspective. And this perspective comes from King David, who wrote this in Psalm 56. You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book. What do you keep track of? What do you collect? You collect and keep track of things that are valuable to you. I dare say that God values you and he sees you in your suffering. He has counted your tears, storing them in a bottle, and knows every drop. The most complete picture of how God approaches us in our suffering is seen in Jesus. And why in Jesus? Jesus tells us that he, this is Jesus speaking, I and the Father are one. Later he says that anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Jesus is God in the flesh. The writer of Hebrews puts it this way: the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. When we see how Jesus dealt with people in their suffering, you can know how God will deal with you in your suffering. And the most profound example of God's compassion in suffering is displayed by Jesus with the death of his friend Lazarus. He called my friend Lazarus. It's recorded in John chapter 11, and Lazarus is the brother of Mary and Martha, and all three of them were disciples of Jesus. Lazarus gets sick, and after several days of being sick, he succumbs to his illness and dies. And then Jesus and the apostles go to the home of Mary and Martha to comfort them, and they catch wind that Jesus is here. He's on his way. The teacher wants to see you. So Martha comes outside and meets Jesus. She approaches him and pours out her heart regarding her brother. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Then her sister Mary comes running up to Jesus, and she falls at his feet and says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Their words are exactly the same. So what does that tell you? It tells you that they were talking about it. Where was Jesus? Where is he? Like, we follow him. How many people have we seen him heal? Again and again and again. And his friend Lazarus is sick, and he's not showing up. They use nice words when they approach Jesus, but I would bet a paycheck that they are blaming him. You could have stopped this. This didn't need to happen. And how many of us have said the exact same things to God? It's your fault. You're the king. You're sovereign. I follow you. I did it all right. Why me? Why him? Why her? This wasn't supposed to happen. And what is Jesus' response to them? He says, where have you laid him? Like, where's he at? Because I'm about to, he doesn't tell him, but he's going to raise him from the dead. And he knows what he's about to do. He knows their pain, and he knows they're about to celebrate like they have never celebrated before. And what does Jesus do? Jesus wept. Jesus wept. He felt every bit of their pain. And I cannot relieve your suffering. I cannot tell you why such a tragedy has befallen your life. I cannot tell you why your beloved one is suffering or has suffered. I cannot answer the question of why you specifically are suffering. There is no book, there is no chapter, and there is no verse that will give you your why. But what I can tell you is that God cares about your heartache. As evidenced by Jesus, God is deeply moved and troubled by your grief. What I can remind you of is that God descended from heaven and put on flesh in the person of Jesus and experienced human suffering right along with us. He has not exempted himself from suffering. None of us are exempt. Grief and suffering are part of living. We take the bad with the good. And Job is an example of suffering well. His bride is an example of suffering poorly, which I would dare say she is a more accurate representation of how most of us suffer. And the hardest part of suffering well is living in the unknown. When my friend Carol was watching her 12-year-old daughter, Catherine, suffer from cancer, and she couldn't get a clear diagnosis or a clear prognosis. She got the diagnosis, it was cancer, but she didn't know how this was gonna play out. Oh, we're gonna get this fixed. No problem, she's 12, she's young. But she couldn't get a clear answer. So after frustration, she says to the hospital staff, to the doctors, the nurses, by 5 p.m. today, I'm going to get a clear answer, or I am going to tear this hospital apart, brick by brick. Well, 5 o'clock came, and she got the answer that no parent wants to hear. It's terminal. And then, with her terminal diagnosis, Catherine decides to read the book of Job at 12 years old, mind you. And upon finishing it, as she lay dying from cancer, she says, well, Mom, I guess the question is, will I curse God and die, or do I keep my faith? Well, she kept the faith. And in doing so, at last count, or Mom lost count at 20 people. 12-year-old Catherine suffered well. And if you've ever spent time with people who suffer well, you show up at their house to encourage them, or you go to the hospital and you want to encourage them, and they're suffering well, and you leave encouraged. You can't believe it. Well, that's Lenny. Lenny's the father of my friend Brooke. We've been friends since junior high. And when his life was literally being choked out of him by ALS, he, like Job, asked the hard questions. Am I being punished? Did I do something wrong to deserve this? And in his patience and in his faithfulness, he received his answer. It's like, no, Lenny, you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't do something. And from that, he drew closer to his wife and closer to his 4 daughters, and he put them at ease in the face of his suffering. He received clarity about what is most internally important in this life. And with his words, he witnessed to his customers about the life-changing power of Jesus. And at his funeral of over 300 people, they said that his grace in the face of suffering was the most powerful witness. And then, less than a year ago, my friend Tess, friend of many of you, losing her second bout of cancer. She did it once 10 years ago, and now at 48 with 2 teenagers and a loving husband, she's losing. At this point, she's lost. And I asked her, I said, what have you learned through this? And she had told me 2 things. One, the suffering prepares me to die. I'm ready to go. Secondly, loving one another is all that really matters. Makes me wonder, why do we dicker over the most senseless things? Like, we dicker about stuff that does not matter. Suffering well is nothing short of divine. And there are no guarantees how any of us will suffer when our time comes. Be it our own physical suffering or standing in the echo of the suffering of someone we love. I think Mrs. Job was a good woman, a faithful woman who struggled in the face of unspeakable pain and just didn't suffer well. And why do I think that? Because of what her husband said in reply. He replies to her, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And I don't hear this as a scolding or a harsh correction. When I read this, what I hear is a man who loves his wife. He is suffering remarkably well, and he's just trying to encourage her. He didn't call her a foolish woman. He said, "You're talking like a foolish woman." He's just trying to help her pick up the pieces of their shattered life. What I hear is, "Honey, this isn't like you. You don't talk like this. You're not a foolish woman." And I know that this is beyond hard, but do you remember how good God has been to us? We have had a wonderful life, a beautiful family, incredible success. We cannot accept only the good things from God and not the hard things as well. And this sounds just like my friend Jeremy, Tess's husband. And I asked him, I said, "How did you not get bitter as you watched Tess die?" His answer was gratitude. He said, "I just looked at how good my life was with her, a wonderful wife, an incredible mother." He said, "There is so much to be grateful for. There isn't any room for bitterness." In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. So what does all this mean for us? What does this mean for those of you who are either in the midst of your own great suffering, or if you're in the echo of the suffering of someone you love? Well, like last week, we're gonna end with worship. It's not the same song, it's not "Blessed Be Your Name," it's not what Job said or sang. Today, our worship leaders will sing "The Goodness of God." And my invitation to all of you, especially for those of you who don't see God as good, who don't believe in the goodness of God as you once did, my invitation to you is to participate however you can. This song can be received as a prayer over you or as an incantation reminding us that God is good even when life is not. You can sit, you can stand, you can lay down, you can sing, even if you have to choke on the words. God, thank you so much that you count our tears, that you care so deeply, and that you display that in Jesus. And I am so grateful for the people who compiled the accounts of what Job went through, of what Jesus demonstrated, and then we can find some kind of comfort and relief and solace in that. Thank you for the honesty of Job and his wife, and thank you for your grace in our suffering. Thank you that we can trust that you are sovereign, and it's in the name of your Son we pray. Amen.